Welcome, everyone, back to another exciting installment of Ezekiel. Last week we looked at the heavenly chariot. At the symbolism, at the concreteness of it, is how well it's described, and the tremendous amount of movement we have in that chariot to tell us that God isn't settling in one place. God is essentially in constant movement. So we shouldn't feel like, and this is kind of setting up the idea that God isn't kind of, as it were, stuck in Jerusalem. God doesn't live in Jerusalem. God is in motion as much as God wants to be. And again, this idea of a heavenly chariot that we see here, it becomes a really basic part of a Kabbalistic and mystical thought and ideas in Judaism moving forward. So this becomes a really basic part of the way the divine is kind of, I don't know if described or pictured, but this is kind of the thing that you're not allowed to discuss, right? You're not supposed to discuss, it's so mystical, right? But this idea, which we don't actually, which is actually pretty much unique at this point, at least, to Ezekiel. So I did want to address something that came up last week in our constant search for the population of Judea before the end of the First Temple period. And I did want to kind of go back to an article that I quoted at that time, which is, again, Mary Bar-Ilan's article. And I think that I think that there's a mistake in it. I was talking that we said last week, and this is in the article, that at the end of the monarchy of Judea, there were, in his words, not much more than 150,000 people in Judea, and that is Jews, and some 200,000 more in the Galilee and Transjordan. Now, this is the article from Meir Bar-Ilan. It's called Major Trends in Jewish Society in the Land of Israel from the 5th century BCE till the 7th century CE. That is the name of the article. And it's from 2006, if I remember correctly. But I think there's just a mistake in the article. You know, it happens sometimes. You proofread, but you miss it. It's happened to me also. I mean, I'm not Meir Bar-Ilan, but it's the sort of thing that happens because, and I'm going to read the whole paragraph to you, or not the whole paragraph, 2 sentences. Here we are. Okay, so again, he says, one may guess that at the end of the monarchy of Judea, in the destruction of the first temple, there were not much more than 150,000 people in Judea, that is Jews, and some 200,000 more in the Galilee and Transjordan. And as you guys noted, what do you mean? Why were there Jews in the Galilee and Transjordan following the Assyrian exile? And he says, many of them were deported to Babylon. And then in parentheses, he says, around 700 BCE, Sancherib, in other words, the king of Assyria, boasted that he deported 200,150 people from the land of Israel, definitely an exaggeration. So what it seems like he accidentally said that there were, when he was talking about 200,000 people in Galilee and Transjordan, he didn't mean at the end of the monarchy of Judea. He meant there had been those during the monarchy of Judea before the Assyrian exile. So I don't think that there were 200,000 people in Galilee and Transjordan. I'm not sure if there were 150,000 people in Judea. Last week we talked about other estimates. Like Finkelstein says 75,000 in Judea. And in terms of Jerusalem, again, Broshi estimates 25,000 within the walls. And so I think we can go with that and essentially say that they weren't really Jews in Galilee and Transjordan. I think it's a mistake in that article from Meir Bar-Ilan that I was quoting last week. And if we talk about, are we sure that they were exiled? Yes, I mean, Tzvi Gal did an archaeological study. Certainly the lower Galilee was really pretty much decimated. And it looks like the urban centers of the upper Galilee as well. So it really does look like there really was a major exile from the northern kingdom. Again, as we said last week, as we'll say every week, or that we need to, many of them fled south to Judea. So many of them did survive in Judea. And then we do know from the Israelite names, the theophoric names, and there's names with God's name at the end, we know that many of them, or several of them, were kind of co-opted into the Assyrian administration. They moved elsewhere in the Assyrian Empire. We do see their names in popping up in different places, but not staying in the Galilee so much. I think there were still some, and again, those who were able to kind of be part of the Assyrian administration, they didn't have to go so far. But no, I think that was simply a mistake in the article. I'm addressing this because it came up last week. Moving on to Yechezkel. Okay, so again, we ended last week with this tremendous divine epiphany, as it were, seeing the chariot of God and the essentially image of God, the glory of God on the chariot. And so let's pick up from there, and we're going to see Ezekiel's mission. Let's take a look. Oh, I do see that there is something in the chat. So Yafa is asking, did they have the idea that God can only be in one place at a time rather than everywhere at once? That's an interesting question. We know that we have from the first temple period, and I think this is less found in Judea, but in the northern kingdom, we have this of Yud-Keh Vav-Keh, that is in Dan, right? The God that is in Dan, the God that is in, and this was a classic way that people in the ancient world thought of the divine. You have, you have the Baal of such and such a place, the Baal of this other place. So you have the same way, you have the God, Yud-Keh Vav-Keh, Yahweh, who is in Dan, right? Or who is in, now, I don't think that they necessarily thought that God could only be in Jerusalem. Clearly, God is the God. Like, if you're a good Judean, believer, right? The idea isn't that God is just in Jerusalem. The idea is that God rules over the world. But where does God live? Well, he lives in his temple. If you believe that the only real temple is in Jerusalem, that's where God lives. God lives in the temple in Jerusalem. Again, we see this very much in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah, where this is an idea that he's constantly arguing with. The idea that nothing can happen to us because we live in God's city, near God's temple, where God lives, so nothing's going to happen to us, right? So that's a classic idea. I don't think they would think of it as limiting God, but I do think that they would think of it now. Obviously, those of you who are familiar with Shlomo HaMelech, with King Solomon's kind of lecture, as it were, at the dedication of the first Beit HaMikdash, of the first temple, you might say, wait, but he says specifically that, of course, God is not confined to a single place. Well, most scholars take that kind of speech and date it late. They think it's been inserted after, okay, that's been inserted later, yes. So not necessarily second temple, but end of first temple. In other words, it's more, at least, in other words, it's not that speech of Shlomo HaMelech, of King Solomon, is not contemporaneous with King Solomon, right? That it's a theological idea, that someone has inserted in the account of the dedication of the first temple, that God isn't defined by living in the temple, right? That God doesn't need a place to live because of this problematic idea that God, that obviously if you have a temple, God lives there, right? Obviously, why would we have a temple if God doesn't have, if God doesn't live there? So someone felt that it was very important to put that idea into the dedication of the temple. Now you can argue with this. You can say, no, I think that, King Solomon said this lecture, in which case he's already presenting the idea that God doesn't need a place to live. God isn't just, of course, confined to the temple. But we do see that this idea that God lives in the temple and that God is in the temple is a very common idea. And even the fact is that Yechezkel has to set up this idea that God's going to leave the temple. And we'll see that later. and and so it's, and also set up this idea, of course, that God has no problem. Of course, there's movement in God's very, as it were, I can't say essence, but in how God works, right? So he's setting that up because God's got to leave the temple. So let's dive in now to our book. I'll share my screen.
Miriam, could I just
Yes.
a little further on that? So if the idea of God, when the earlier idea that God is in Judea and dwells in the temple, did it go so far as to think that Yahweh has no power outside the boundaries of Israel?
No, I don't think so. Certainly not. I don't think so. Certainly not in this period, because there are prophets are given, and in general, the idea that prophets can prophesy about what's happening in other nations indicates that God has power outside of the land of Israel. And of course, a big part of the, let's say, the fully fleshed belief in God is that God is the creator of the world, right? And that God is the God of the world, right? Now you can start arguing, because there are people who kind of split hairs and say, yes, but what did most people in Judea actually believe? What did they actually do? What were they, in the northern kingdom of Israel? They were clearly worshiping, there was idol worship, or idol worship, worship of other gods, as it were. What did they actually believe? But the fact is, in the full-fledged belief in God, the Lord, in the Lord God of Israel, the idea is that he created the world, and that he controls everything, right? So, and that he can, and that he can determine who wins in the kind of battle of empires that Israel is smack dab in the middle of, right? So it's and that we see, early on in prophecy as well. In other words, when Hosea is saying, why are you going to Assyria? Why are you going to Egypt? You should be relying on God, right? The idea is that God has control over these other nations. You can say, oh, well, it's just the land of Israel. I don't think it's limited that way. The idea is supposed to be that God has ultimate power. And of course, and that's why it's very important to say God means for us to be under Babylon. Don't rebel, right? And that is the prophecy that kind of carries us forward, because that's the problem of empire. If we're defeated, does that mean that our God is weaker, that our God lost? And the answer is no. This is what God wanted, right? This was God's plan. This is from God, that we were defeated, right? So this is and again, this is one of these things that Jeremiah talks about constantly, that no, we're supposed to be a vassal state of Babylon. Don't rebel. Rebelling is not going to take us anywhere good. And of course, no one listens to him ever. So what happens, right? But then it's like, okay, well, I told you, God told you. Oh, so I do want to kind of make sure that I answered Yafa's thing. So I don't think that Jews at this time thought that God could only be in one place at a time. But I do think that they still had this idea that God lives in the temple. Okay, so we ended with the last chapter, right, which is the first chapter of the book, which we did last week. That he sees kind of a figure that's like a semblance of a person. That figure is essentially the glory of God, right? And then again, he sees that gleam, the ke'en chashmal, the thing that's like chashmal, which seems to be something tremendously shiny and glowing, like a fire, like in a fire that's around it, and that is what this God divine figure looks like from the waist up, and from the waist down, just complete fire and glowing with a rainbow around it. And that is the Dmut Kvod Hashem, the appearance of the glory of God, right? He is trying to be careful here in terms of not describing it to like, oh, this looks exactly like a person, or this is a person, or this is God. It's the appearance of the glory of God. And I saw it, right? I saw him, I fell on my face, and I heard a voice of speaking. Vayomer Eli, Ben Adam, amod al raglecha v'daber otach. And so God said, mortal person, right? Son of man, stand on your feet, on your legs, and I will speak with you. So stand up. Now I did look this up, and so Ben Adam, mortal, appears in Yechezkel and Ezekiel 93 times. Yechezkel is in fact never called by name when God speaks to him. God always calls him mortal. It does, as I said before, it does indicate kind of a smallness, that he's a small person next to the glory of God. You are a mortal man, and that is how he is addressed constantly. Daniel is called this once in the book of Daniel, in Daniel 8:17. So yes, in Daniel 8:17. He's called Ben Adam, mortal, but that's all that Yechezkel's ever called by God, over and over and over again. Vatavovi ruach kasher diber elai v'tamideni al raglai v'shma et midaber elai. So a spirit came into me. Again, Yechezkel's completely overwrought. God says, stand up. A spirit comes up to him and stands him up on his feet. But the spirit itself stands me up on my feet, and I heard what he was speaking to me. Vayomer Eli, Ben Adam, sholeach ani otcha el bnei Yisrael el goyim hamordim asher marduvi hema v'avotam pashuvi at etzem hayom hazeh. He said, mortal, I am sending you to the people of Israel, to the nations that are to the rebellious nations that rebelled against me. They and their forefathers rebelled against me until this very day. V'habanim kshe panim v'chizkei lev ani sholech otcha lehem v'amart lehem kol amar Adonai Elohim. And these children, these descendants that are hard of face and strong of heart, and they do not listen, they are stubborn as all get out. I am sending you to them, and you will say to them, so says the Lord God. Vehema im yishma'u ve'im yichdalu ki v'hema. So either they're going to listen, or they're going to listen and stop what they did, or they won't, because they are a rebellious house. But they will know that there was a prophet among them. Okay, in other words, whether or not they listen, they'll understand that you were a prophet, that they heard a prophet. A prophet came to them and told them and warned them. We know this is an idea in general that God, that it's a gift from God to get prophets coming and warning us, right? So the idea seems to be, whether or not they listen, God has done his part and sent them a prophet, and they will know, well, at least we got a prophet, right? We have there's nothing we can say, right? V'ata ben adam, al tira mehem umidivreihem al tira, ki saravim v'salonim otach, ve'al akrabim ata yoshev midivreihem al tira uvneihem al techat ki bet merihem. Okay, so you mortal, don't be scared of them, and don't be scared of their words, right? Because they're going to seem very dangerous to you, right? So they're going to be like thorns against you. You're sitting among scorpions. Don't fear their words, and don't fear their presence, because they are a rebellious house. Okay. And once again, it says, and you should say my words to them, whether or not they listen, right? Because they're rebellious. Now, this is the concrete part of Yechezkel's mission, you could say, his calling. He says, and you, mortal, listen to what I'm telling you. Don't be rebellious like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I am going to give you. And I looked and I saw it here. There's a hand that's stretched out to me and it's holding a scroll. Right, and it's spread out before me, and I see that it's written front and back, so it's apparently papyrus and not parchment. Parchment in this time, they didn't know yet how to write both sides. They could only write on it one side in terms of the treatment. So it's papyrus that you could write both sides on. And it also seems more edible, doesn't it? Papyrus. So it's yeah, and we're going to see it needs to be, he's going to have to swallow this. Sorry, spoiler. And so I looked at it and it's filled with lamentations and wails and cries, right? It's just filled with sadness and awfulness. The whole thing, written front and back. ויאמר אלי בן אדם את אשר תמצא אכול את המגילה הזאת ולך דבר אל בית ישראל. And he said to me, mortal, that which you have in front of you, eat this scroll and go speak to the house of Israel. I opened my mouth and God fed me this scroll. And he said, mortal, your stomach will digest, and your belly will be filled with this scroll that I'm giving to you. And I ate it, and it was in my mouth, sweet as honey. Now, this is interesting. I'm going to talk about this, and I'm also going to show you the parallel in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah. But this idea of not only is Yechezkel absorbing the prophecy, it's becoming his. Right? It's going to be in his stomach, right? As Radak says, your stomach, you're not going to throw it up. It's not going to be thrown up out of your mouth. Your stomach is going to be able to take this in. And so Yechezkel it's going to become part of Yechezkel. And then Yechezkel will speak almost on his own because the prophecy itself will fill his belly. And this horrible prophecy has become sweet. Now, this is parallel very much to Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah 15, which I opened just now. Okay, where Yirmiyahu Jeremiah is remembering his calling and saying to God, please, I did everything you wanted. Don't let me die, right? Because poor Jeremiah, it's hard being Yirmiyahu, right? And he says, your words were there and I ate them. And your words were for me for joy and the happiness of my heart. Because your name was called on me, Lord God. Okay. There's going to be another parallel here that we're going to come back to later. And this idea, it's parallel, but look how much more concrete it is when Yechezkel's saying it. He's literally eating it. He's literally eating a scroll. It's literally filling his stomach. Now, of course, we're supposed to understand this is not a literal scroll. It's a divine scroll. It's not literally, but as with everything with Yechezkel, everything becomes much more concrete. And it literally tastes sweet. The horrible prophecy has become sweet to Yechezkel. We're going to see that this is actually not the end of his struggle with the problem with this prophecy. Vayomer Eli ben Adam lech bo el Beit Yisrael v'dibarta b'dvarai elam. He says, okay, now go to the house of Israel and speak my words to them. Ki lo el am im kesafa v'chivdei lashon shaluach el Beit Yisrael. You're not sent to some nation that with hard to understand speech and difficult language. I'm sending you to the house of Israel. right? So you can speak the same language. Not to the many nations of these difficult languages that you don't know, that you don't understand their words. If I had sent them to you, if I had sent you to them, they would be listening to you, right? So it's not these nations who don't even speak your language, but ironically would listen to you if you went and prophesied to them. No, I'm going to send you to Beit Yisrael, who will understand you very well, but won't want to listen. Beit Yisrael, lo yovu l'shmoa, the house of Israel is not going to want to listen to you. Because they don't want to listen to me. They don't want to listen to me. Because they are all strong of forehead and tough of heart, meaning they are stubborn. They have decided on their way. They will not change their mind. They do not want to listen to God. But even though, so they're stubborn, but I'm going to make you just as stubborn, right? Behold, I am going to make your face strong opposite theirs, right? So you're going to be as hard as theirs. And your forehead will be strong as opposed to their forehead. You're going to be just as stubborn as they are. Right? I'm going to make your forehead hard as flint. You should not fear them, because they are a rebellious house. It's right. The translation here is correct. It really isn't because, it's really although they are a rebellious house.
Miriam,
yes.
That word shamir, isn't there a medrash that was some kind
that's a worm. That's the worm that cuts the stone. Stone for yeah. But it's here. It's pretty clear that it does mean, in fact, a type of stone. Okay, so Vayomer Eli ben Adam et kol dvarai asher daber elecha kach b'lvavcha uve'aznecha shema. So, and God said to me, mortal, everything I speak to you, you should take into your heart and you should listen with your ears. Receive with your heart means you should understand it, right? Remember that the heart is considered like the mind, actually, in the ancient world, and you do your thinking in your heart, right? So it means everything I say to you, contemplate it, understand it, and listen with your ears. And then go to the exilic community, to your people. And you should go and you should say to them, so says the Lord God, if whether they listen or not. Okay. But tisa any ruach veshma acharei kol rash gadol baruch kvod Adonai mimkomo. And a great spirit lift me up, and I heard behind me a tremendous sound. Blessed is the glory of God in its place, right? Which is apparently the call of the angels. If we go into Isaiah, so, and this is not exactly the same, right? But it's here the angels call, and they talk about God being holy, and the whole earth is filled with his glory, right? And here we're saying, blessed is the glory of God. It's the same word, right? Kvodo melocho, it's kvodo. His presence, his glory fills the whole land. And here, blessed is the glory of God in its place. V'kol kanfei chayot meshikot isha lachota. Now, again, remember that chariot, it was essentially on these animals. So the wings of the animals are all, are beating against each other. V'kol ha'ofanim l'matam, and the wheels, remember the sound of the wheels. V'kol rash gadol, a tremendous noise. V'ruach nesa'adni v'tikacheni ve'elech mar b'chamat ruchi b'yad Adonai alai chazaka. And this great wind lifted me and took me, and I went bitter in the anger of my spirit, and the hand of God was strong on me. In other words, on the one hand, he absolutely feels his prophetic calling. He feels the hand of God, but he is not happy, right? He's not happy with what he has to do. Vavo el hagola tel Aviv hayoshvim el nahar var, and I came to the exilic community in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, not our Tel Aviv of today, but where we got the name. Tel Aviv is, of course, in Babylon. Its Akkadian name is Tel Abubi. Til Abu, like it's really more like Til Abube, I think. But that would be, Tel is the same. So in other words, it means Tel, namely a settled hill. Abube means from the time of the flood. So this was a place that where there was a tradition that it was ancient enough that it was from the time of the flood. If you recall that the story of the flood spans the entire ancient Near East, pretty much has a story of the flood. And so that's the root of this name. Tel Aviv, our Tel Aviv, is because they wanted a name to combine the old Tel, which is usually an archaeological Tel, Aviv, the spring, constantly renewed. And here is this name in the Bible, even though this name in the Bible is for a place outside of Israel. So he returned to Tel Aviv by the river Kvar. And he settled there. The exiles are sitting there. And I sat there 7 days, stunned among them, silenced among them. He did not speak for 7 days. Okay, now this is also parallel to Yirmiyahu, to Jeremiah. If you see right after he talks about devouring God's words and them being a joy, he says, Lo yashafti, here I am once more in Yirmiyahu Tedvav, Jeremiah 15. Lo yashafti besod mesachakim be'elos, mifnei yadcha badad yashafti, ki za'am mileitani. I did not dwell among people who were, among revelers, and I was not gay because, I did not make merry, because of your hand, that was on me, I sat alone because I was filled with anger. Very, very parallel to Yechezkel's experience following his calling, that God's hand is on him, but that means that he cannot be with people, he cannot speak, and he is angry. If you were to ask me which one is based on the other, I would say it would look more like Yechezkel is based on Yirmiyahu, because Yirmiyahu is just kind of like saying it very, very briefly. Yechezkel is much more spelling it out a lot more. At the same time, it's a very evocative description here, and something that we can completely understand based on the description that we've had of what his calling is going to be, namely saying miserable things, just miserable things to a bunch of people who don't want to hear them. And we're going to see that those miserable things essentially are mainly during the period up to the exile, the final destruction of the first temple. After that, he's going to have much more of a role of encouragement. But until that time, he is going to be very involved in kinim vehega vehi, lamentations and woe and wails, because that is what is being prophesied. But now he is silent he's stunned for 7 days. He's silent for 7 days. Vayhi mikseh shivat yamim. I want to say something here. And it was at the end of 7 days. Now we're going to go into another explanation of what Yechezkel's mission is, of what Yechezkel's calling is. Now you see this pay here, right? That's a Parsha Ptucha. That means there's a blank, right, till the end of the line, right? So that blank, or is it till the end of the line, or partially, that blank is generally, and it's in the middle of a verse. It's usually, you don't have that space. If you know, let me see if I can find, hold on just a second. let me, I'm just opening my Tanakh here so you can see it physically. Here we are. Sorry, it's not to the end of the line. It's going to be only a part of the line. Here we are. Okay. I'm not sure you can see this. Let me just stop my share. And I don't see myself. Here we are.
If you move it,
I'll take my blur off, and you'll get to see my whole background here. Yes. Is it clean enough? No. Okay. So here, here's the beginning of the verse. Okay. Here's the beginning of the verse. Here's the middle of the verse, and here's a space. Can you see that? There's a space in the middle of the verse, right? Very unusual to have a space like that in the middle of the verse. You'll see on the page how it's split up by these spaces. So the spaces in general are the earliest divisions we have in the written Hebrew Bible. In the written Tanakh, those are the earliest divisions we have. What do I mean by the earliest divisions we have? I mean that in a Torah, in a Torah scroll, you don't have a division by verse, right? If those verses don't have divisions, there's certainly no division, but for half verses, there's missing pretty much all the divisions that we have in the sort of Tanakh that we read from. The only divisions you're going to have are those spaces in the lines. And in fact, we have those divisions as well at Qumran and Qumran scrolls and in scrolls from the Second Temple period. So early on, we already had divisions like that where there were paragraph divisions. So those paragraph divisions are the oldest that we have in all these written texts. So it means something when you get a paragraph division in the middle of a verse. What does it mean here? What it means here is this is essentially an insertion, a section. What it seems to mean here, and I say this because we can't always say that this is true. Usually it does in fact indicate a change in subject. It is a division. It's like a content division. What we have here is probably almost certainly an indication that someone inserted this piece from somewhere else in the book, right? Because we're talking about Yechezkel's calling. I'll tell you why, because his 7 days of silence are going to kind of just go right into the section following this one, right? His 7 days of silence and then what God gives him in terms of symbolic acts, that works together. This little piece is an explanation of Yechezkel's calling, which doesn't directly flow from his 7 days of silence at all, and seems to be inserted here. So let's look again at our verses, and you'll see what I mean. Okay, so here again, it's after those 7 days, stop. And now we're going to go a whole section explaining another aspect of his calling, right? And then in, where does it come back? And then upon another space, it'll say, and then God's hand was on me, and he says, get up, go out to the valley. In other words, this whole section about this other aspect of his calling has been inserted between the two paragraph markers, all right? And we have this paragraph marker in the middle of the verse essentially to tell us, hey, we're stopping here, we're bringing this other piece, and then we're going to come back to this about what happened at the end of the 7 days, okay? All right. Obviously, this is an interpretation. I am relying heavily on Rimon Kasher, but it absolutely works. Like you can see everything here is telling you this is what happened. The switch in content, the paragraph markers, etc. Okay, so let's read about this other aspect of his calling, and then we will save the prophetic actions for next week. That will also be fun. So he says, "Vayidvar Adonai elai lemor." The word of God was to me, saying, "Ben Adam, sofen et haticha levet Yisrael v'shamata mipi davar v'izharta ota mimeni." Mortal, I have made you a watchman, a lookout. Lookout is better. A lookout for the house of Israel. And you will listen and you will hear something from my mouth, and you will warn them from me. Okay, that's your job. You're a lookout. You give them warnings that you have received from me. Who Okay, what does it mean that you're a lookout? What it means is, if I say to a wicked person, you're going to die, and you didn't warn him, you didn't speak to warn the evil person to go away from his evil path to live, he, as an evil person, will in fact die for his sin. And I am going to charge you with his death because you didn't warn him. In other words, if I tell you, prophet, warn them, and you keep your mouth shut, and they keep on doing their evil thing, oh, they're going to die because they did the evil thing. But you're responsible, and I'm holding you responsible. But if you warn the wicked person, he doesn't change his ways. He doesn't go change his ways from being a wicked person. He will die for his sin. And you saved your life. You saved your life because you warned him. Now you're not responsible. He's still dead. He didn't change, right? So you have a couple of aspects here. One, there is this chance that they're going to listen to you and they're going to change their ways. There's a kind of an optimism here. Maybe they can save themselves. But also, whether or not they listen to you, you must speak. I don't care they don't want to listen to you. I don't care. It doesn't make a difference. You want to you want to do your job. You want to be free of responsibility here for their deaths, for their inevitable deaths. Then you will speak to them. You will prophesy to them. Okay. Similarly, right? Now we're going to talk about righteous people. And if a righteous person changes his way from being righteous and does something wicked, I put a stumbling block before him, he's going to die. In other words, a person who's normally righteous, God gave him a challenge and he wasn't up to it. Okay? I gave a challenge and he's wicked. He's going to die, right? Because you didn't warn him of the stumbling block I put in his way. You should have warned him. I told you, you should have warned him. You didn't warn him, and he's going to die for his sin. And all the good things he did won't be remembered because now he was wicked. That's a whole theme that's going to come up later when Ezekiel talks about you got to stay good. If you mess it up with wickedness, you could still die for being wicked, right? I'm going to hold you responsible for his death. In other words, he's going to die. Again, I'm going to hold you responsible because you didn't warn him of this stumbling block that was going to cause him to sin. All right. But if you warn a righteous person not to sin, and he's a righteous person, he didn't sin, he's going to live because he was warned. And you saved your life here. You saved two people. Note that a wicked person in this scenario, a wicked person's a wicked person. He's not going to listen. He's going to die. But at least if you said something to him, you are not held responsible. Here, a righteous person you can save. And then not only have you saved yourself, you've saved him, right? So this is your job as a prophet. You've got to talk to everyone, the people who don't listen and the people who listen. The people who don't listen, they'll die, but at least you're not responsible. The people who listen, you saved them and you saved yourself. And now you see the pay there, that's another space, right? So now we come back to coming out of the 7 days of silence, but he's not really coming out of the 7 days of silence and shock. He's going to go into a new thing. I'm just going to finish this briefly. All right, just so we can go in and then we'll come back to it next week, because this is the introduction to the beginning of Yechezkel's prophecy, as it were, which starts from the very beginning with symbolic actions. And next week, we're going to talk about how his symbolic actions are different from other prophets' symbolic actions, because there's a whole range of symbolic actions that we see with the prophets of Israel and Yehudah. And Yechezkel is very interesting because it's they're really the most concrete and drawn out in its way. But it's very interesting to contrast his actions with Yirmiyahu. Actually, you know what? We'll start with the end of this chapter next week, because I do want to mention that in Yechezkel, where could this section about Yechezkel being a lookout be from? Like, where in the book would it normally have been if it weren't brought here so that we know about this aspect of his calling? Possibly in Yechezkel Lamed Gimel, Yechezkel 33, or close to it, okay, where it's explained to us the idea of the lookout, like in depth, right, or further in depth, right? He's talking about why am I calling a prophet a lookout? Because the job of a lookout is to say, look what's coming. You can take action to save yourselves. In other words, this thing that's coming is going to come. If you see an army coming, the army's coming. The lookout doesn't change the fact that the army's coming, but the lookout helps people defend themselves. In other words, God's going to tell Yechezkel this bad thing is coming. That doesn't necessarily mean you can stop the bad thing, but at least you'll be able to save yourselves from the bad thing. Maybe, right? So that's and also, and this is something that's very much in Yechezkel Lamed Gimel chapter 33. Again, it's up to the people to take action. The lookout cannot force them to take action. All the lookout can say is, this is what's coming. You need to take action. Then it's on them to take the action. If they don't take action, they die. But at least the lookout did his job, right? And that's the idea of the lookout. So it's only in chapter 33 that we're going to get an explanation of why is he a lookout? Why a lookout, right? And the answer is because of this same relationship, that a lookout to do his job, it's his job to tell everyone. If they won't listen, that's not his fault, but at least he did his job and he gave them the chance to save themselves. That's Yechezkel's job. He's got to tell them and give them the chance to save themselves. Okay, and with that, I'm going to conclude and take questions. So what did we see, just as a very brief recap? What did we see here? We saw that initial calling of Yechezkel, that it's just going to be a lot of misery. We saw, however, that he took his prophecy into himself. It's going to be kind of be part of him, and yet he still has this anger and distress, and stays quiet and shocked for 7 days. And then as we wait for him to come out of the 7 days, we get the other account of his calling, which is his job as a lookout, to warn people whether or not they listen. And that explains to us what, and I probably brought here to explain to us, because it seems very distressing and confusing. Why is God sending him to speak to people whether they listen or not, which is repeated over and over and over in his initial calling? And the answer is because Yechezkel is a lookout. A lookout has to warn people whether or not they listen and give them the chance to save themselves. And now I am open to questions and comments. Oh, here, Danny and Libby say, point of trivia. Before being given as a name to the new city, originally referred to as Achuzat Bayit, the name Tel Aviv was the title given to the earliest Hebrew translation of Herzl's Alt Neuland. That's a good translation. That's nice. I like that kind of. Yeah, that's a cool thing. That Alt Neuland was translated as Tel Aviv because the old and the new. Cute.
The alt is the Tel, and the Noi is the Aviv.
Yeah. Oh, so that's why. And the city got its name from the title of the Hebrew translation. Okay, thank you.
Right.
I was missing that piece. Right. Okay.
So got it. I was missing that. Yeah. The people who are being weird or outside the box were not the people who gave the city its name. It was the people who translated Alt Neuland.
Got it. So yes, that was my missing piece there.
Of Dafka naming the first new Hebrew city to be built on the soil of Eretz Yisrael, Dafka naming it after a city in the Golah.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, thank you for joining me, and join me next week for Yechezkel's symbolic actions.